Let me welcome everyone on the webinar organized by Early Career Forecaster Group. Today with me, there are two special guests, Mike Gilliland, who's the editor of Foresight, and Pierre Pinson, who's the editor-in-chief of International Journal of Forecasting.
Thanks.
So, as a start, if I can ask you, our lovely guests, to introduce yourself and also to introduce your journal to anyone who doesn't actually know what International Journal of Forecasting or the Foresight might be about. And Mike, can I ask you to start?
Certainly. I'm Mike Gilliland. I retired a year ago from SAS after about 17 years there in product management and marketing. And prior to that, worked in industry forecasting jobs and some consulting work for about 20 years. Then October 1st, upon the retirement of our founding editor, Len Tashman, I took over as editor. And my first task was to appoint or anoint Stefan as my deputy editor. Foresight is published quarterly. Our purpose, our mission is to publish material that's of practical use to people doing forecasting across basically any industry. Papers are reviewed and edited by our editorial staff. For relevance of the contents, are there practical takeaways that forecasters can put to use in their jobs? And also very important for clarity of presentation, making the writing accessible. We've got a lot of PhDs in statistics and econometrics and so on in our audience, our readership, but also we're mainly targeted for these practicing forecasters who may not have the heavy mathematical background to say follow through an article that's published in IJF or another academic journal. So what we try to do is extract the takeaways from the research, put it in a plain language that pretty much anyone working in business can understand, and then use that to improve their work. Last thing is we try to take a very critical view, meaning we're trying to provide critical assessments of the forecasting process. We're not just trying to be cheerleaders of every new method that comes away. We really want people to be thinking deeply about the fundamental issues that affect their ability to forecast and run their organizations effectively. So in a nutshell, that's forecasting. That's Foresight.
Cool. So and now we're going to talk about the IJF. So first of all, I'm Pierre Pinson. I'm a professor at Imperial College in London. I started here recently, and my research focus a lot on what we can do with data, how we can get value out of data, and forecasting is one of the big thing we can do. But we're not here to discuss that. We're here to discuss the journal. So the IJF is now a very well established journal in the landscape when you consider forecasting. It was established in '85, in the mid '80s. So now we're at volume 38, right? We have one volume per year and quarterly issues. We can see it as I don't know, big brother or twin brother journal of Foresight, because what Mike didn't say is that both journals are actually owned by the IJF. So which is nice in the landscape of the scientific and practitioners literature. You would like journals to be independent of publishers, right? So these two journals are owned by the IJF, and we have contracts for publishing. And so for the IJF, it's a bit more academic. So the contract is with Elsevier. For Foresight, it's more independent. But that makes that IJF is an academic journal with a special flavor, with this independence, we could say. The journal is not targeting just practitioner. It's more of a classical scientific and academic journal. We really want to push the boundary in terms of forecasting. And what's beautiful with forecasting is that it's at the interface between methods and application. So that gives us a lot of flexibility in terms of the context we can consider, and also that allows to bring people that want to push with new ideas that are more mathematical, and also people that come from the practitioner side and say, okay, you know, I have this data set, I have this problem. I want to show people what I would do if I want to forecast for this data set or this test case. So that would be an introduction to the IJF.
Lovely. So the very first question that comes to my mind when I'm hearing about the journal is basically what kind of articles, what kind of topics can I find in those journals? So for example, if I'm looking for those topics that are in the journals, what those topics will be that I can find in Foresight and in IJF? Yep.
Yeah, and Foresight, just taking from the author guidelines, forecast modeling and automation, judgmental forecasting, performance measurement, and forecasting process. We cut across pretty much any industry, a lot of coverage of retail and supply chain. We do financial forecasting. We cover forecasting systems, long-range forecasting, and also the planning aspects, sales and operations planning and integrated business planning. We do some articles on that. We've recently added some new editors in underserved areas, the areas we haven't typically covered a lot of in the past. Elaine Deschamps is covering on in government and public policy forecasting. Sherry Debates on the call here on judgmental forecasting. Evangelos Spiliotis will be covering the artificial intelligence and machine learning aspects relevant to forecasting. Tao Hong is going to be covering energy and environment. And also over the summer, we added a dedicated book review editor, Mark Little. As an example of the kind of material, the way we organize the journal, we're doing a big special feature section in the Q1 issue on the topic of, does forecast accuracy even matter? And this was motivated by a submission from Johan, who's on the call here. And we've got, I think, end up with 7 or 8 different articles, different perspectives on this issue of, does accuracy even matter? Some were doing simulation showing, you know, yes or no, how that impacts the decisions and costs and so on. But it's trying to tie the link between accuracy of the forecast and actual value to the business, the decisions and actions that it impacts, and ultimately the profit that you make from a business. We also are adding 2 new things to the journal. That will be an opinion editorial column in each issue, where someone can go in and just, again, doesn't have to be based on hard research or anything, but just provide a perspective. It's kind of an intellectual kick to people to just start thinking about issues that they may not have been thinking about previously, and just generate a new thought and discussion. And another thing is the mini tutorial. In the past, we've published full-length tutorials on topics, say exponential smoothing, you know, a several page or multi-part article on that. But there are concepts, it occurred to me over the summer reading a manuscript by Stefan, where he mentioned pinball loss, which is something mentioned frequently in academic literature, but really you never hear it discussed in practitioner space. So Stefan has contributed. These are short 1 to 2 page, preferably graphic, intensive pieces that just cover a very specific topic that a practitioner may not be aware of, that we think is important enough for them to cover. So that's another example of the kind of topics and the kind of papers that we welcome.
Yeah. And yeah, so for the IJF, in terms of the attitude, it's pretty much the same. All topics are welcome as long as it relates to forecasting. And we see lately, you know, there's a boost of interest in data-driven decision making. And sometimes, you know, it's kind of forecasting, but it's not really forecasting. I'm thinking, for instance, of prescriptive analytics, so you can directly do data-driven decision making, but jumping over the forecasting step. So yeah, we can even drift towards this kind of thing as long as it has this component, like we're looking towards the future and we're supporting the decision. Yeah, we're helping with decision making, sorry. After, we don't want to have specific categories in the IJF because we didn't want people to feel they have to tag their paper. Is this a more methodological paper, application focused paper? But there is this component. Obviously, some of the papers are more there to bring something new in terms of methods. That can be some new models, some new views on forecasting. Mike just mentioned Pilbone loss, right? It relates to probabilistic aspects. So in the probabilistic space, there's a lot of room for new methods in verification, for instance. So we welcome all these papers that are more mathematical, methodological. But obviously, a tradition for the IJF is to be close to applications. So if someone submitted a very theoretical paper and we have no idea how it would impact forecasting in practice, maybe IJF is not the best place, right? Maybe there are more statistical journals that could be there for that. So yeah, and after, it's also something we're very open-minded. There are a lot of people who contact me asking, you know, is this paper something that would fit in the IJF? And I'm very happy to discuss it with any prospective author. Some author are asking, you know, I want to publish a data set related to a forecast competition. Some people say, you know, I want to criticize some other people's paper and their method because I could not reproduce the work. In general, we are very open-minded and happy to welcome any kind of contribution, but people who contact me also have to be able to hear no for an answer, because obviously it's not because you contact the editor-in-chief that that it's going to be a yes, right? But in principle, we're very open-minded.
I mean, I'm glad to hear that those journals just covered a vast amount of the forecasting field and with all different topics and different approaches. Maybe a little bit of the tip. Do you found any topic right now which can be considered as a hot topic that emerging recently in your fields?
Practitioner space, I think probabilistic, forecasting, providing not traditionally. I mean, I worked in industry forecasting for 20 years before I joined SAS, and you know, all we ever looked at were point forecasts. And a point forecast, yeah, that's God gives you some useful information, but unless you have some sense of the likelihood of that being really closely accurate or not, or how wide your confidence is in that forecast, for the decision that's being made, the planning decision, like on inventories or staffing or so on, you need to have that aspect. And so we're seeing a lot more coverage of that probabilistic forecasting area now becoming of interest to practitioners.
Yeah, so and I agree from the more academic point of view. I mean, probabilistic forecasting, I think, was a focus maybe earlier in academia than for practitioners. Well, it depends on the field maybe, but still overall. So I think probabilistic forecasting is still an area where there's a need for a lot of work on both practitioner side and academic side. I think we also see some of the new topics that are appearing due to the change in the volumes of data or the type of decision problems that we see around. So, you know, there's been a big focus on forecast reconciliation. So if we can define a hierarchy of time series, right? Some people have been looking at global versus local models, because we have so many time series. You know, do we learn a single model for all time series, or do we have one model per time series? So we have a lot of new problem that comes from the context, that we have more data, more problems, more applications we can consider. But then there are also more fundamental problems, I think, in forecasting. As I said, verification, forecast verification has been taken for granted. You know, we have these error measures, we have these diagnostic tools, but actually we realize, you know, that we can do more, right? And we realize also, as Mike indicated before, if we want to connect forecast quality to value, so you can make your forecast more accurate, right? But does it bring value to business or to decision making? Then we need to further develop the forecast verification framework, to do that. So I think, yeah, there's a lot of nice topics right now to write on and to research on.
Oh, definitely. We are living in the interesting times. So interesting papers comes from interesting times. As a question about the papers, what kind of qualities the paper should have in order to be published in your journals?
Yeah, the main thing in Foresight is that the content has to be of some use, practical, something that they can, a practicing forecaster can take away and apply in doing their jobs. For material that's based on academic research, we definitely, one thing we really like to have is extract those maybe from a highly mathematical paper, extract those takeaways and put it into a more accessible form and give it to the practitioner. So those of you working on these really deep research areas of research and so on, don't feel you're limited to just the academic journals to publish that. Extract what you can from that, and you can send it to Foresight, and we would like to share the results of that. And we, as I think I mentioned, we're not trying to be, we're not cheerleaders for anything. We want to provide information, useful information that's based on solid research, on logic, on evidence, all those sorts of things. And so stuff coming out of the academic research areas is a great source for us. In terms of making the material accessible to our readership, we don't really care about the mathematical derivations. We're not so concerned about methodological issues and so on. We would just suggest, hey, put in the references. Here's the paper that discusses all the details if a person wants to dig into. Just focus on those, maybe there are 3 to 5 key takeaways that come from that research, and that's what we'd like you to share.
Yeah, for the IJF, the angle is different because the purpose of the two journals are obviously different too. IJF is there as a journal that contribute to the scientific debate, like a lot of these international peer-reviewed journals. So a main, let's say, one of the main criteria to contribute to the scientific debate is rigor, obviously, and novelty. Because we don't contribute to the scientific debate by just crowding it with stuff we already know. So some of the leading criteria that we look into when we first receive papers is novelty. Do we believe that our community or people who are interested in forecasting, they're going to learn something new, or it's going to trigger them, into starting some new research or push it further? We receive so many. There's a question by Stefan about which papers get rejected. So it's kind of the other way to look at it. There are many people who submit papers to the IJF where they found a time series, they got the time series, I don't know, of corner kicks at the World Cup, or I don't know, whatever time series you think of. And then they directly apply a model, let's say an ARMA model to it. And then they do forecasting, right? And they don't even justify why they would apply this model. They just have this data, they have a model, let's just do something with it, right? Does it bring something novel? I mean, it's nice. It's a nice application, and maybe the results are interesting. But if we don't have something that's novel, that's really pushing the debate, the scientific debate, then for the IJF, it's not something that we are very interested in. So that would be the main criteria. After, I mean, some authors can actually write a cover letter where they argue for the case. So for instance, I was talking about time series and application of a single model. Maybe if the author says in the cover letter, this time series, it's a crazy one, right? It's very complex what's going on there. And we're having a first try at it. Okay, it's not amazing, but we want to share the data and invite others to attack this problem, right? So, I mean, that's what mathematicians do. There's a conjecture and they say, okay, I throw it out there, guys, have a go, right? So sometimes paper can be interested if it's coming from a certain data set, right? But it triggers scientific interest, right? So I think that's the main thing that the prospective authors should think of. Can I bring scientific novelty with my paper and whatever I cover in there?
So on the topic of Foresight, what is the expected level of rigor in terms of, so, IJF is a peer-reviewed academic journal. So, there's a certain amount of, like, you have to back it up with references, or you have to prove it yourself empirically or theoretically. But with Foresight, I've personally been stuck with a couple of things that I was hoping to submit that they're all accrued tribal wisdom gathered by myself and several of my colleagues, which I can't just back them up with a reference. I'm not making this stuff up, obviously, but at the same time, it's a very subjective point of view that I gathered through my career that I can't just point to a reference nor to a theorem. And I'm kind of like, is this, how do I not devolve into medium.com territory and still keep a certain level of rigor when writing for Foresight without going all the way to peer-reviewed academic publication?
Yeah, I think there's two ways you can go on that. If it's purely kind of a subjective opinion, something meant to be provocative, the op-ed pieces, which we say, up to about 1,000 words, to just throw out some crazy idea out there, whatever, to stir up some discussion and things. In your case, though, it sounds more like a paper that may be closer to something like a case study or just a description of things that you're doing and what you're finding. And I would find that, perfectly acceptable kind of material for us to publish, assuming, kind of like Pierre says, there's something novel and interesting in what you're doing and what you're finding. And not only positive things you find, but failings that you find, maybe a story that you attempted this method that you'd read about elsewhere that you came up with, but it really didn't work very well on what you're doing. So certainly, if there's research backing up, footnotes and research that you can use to back up certain claims that you're making, that's great. But don't feel handcuffed by that sort of thing. If you've got some interesting findings that you think the community could benefit from, I definitely encourage you to reach out to me or any of our editors with the thoughts and put something together.
Yeah, I think Mike is right. Think of a journal like the Harvard Business Review. It's a bit that, it's not with theorems and references. It's a lot based on managerial experience, sharing successes, sharing observations. And there, the credibility comes also from the work of the editors and potential reviewers to actually challenge you, where you come from to write this piece. And trying to say, okay, this person has our stamp, right? It seems legit. It is possible. It is written in a way that is really describing thoroughly how they came to this observation, right? And so sharing some novel insight in forecasting can also be like that. We don't just have a need for theorems, and empirical studies all the time. It can also be based on experience. And I think that's the role of Foresight, right? So as long as the team at Foresight is rigorous in dealing with your paper and advising you on what can be said and not said, I think it's worth a try.
Thanks.
Thank you, Skander, for your interesting question, which actually nicely segues me to the next one. Mike, Pierre, if you can unravel a little bit of your work and operations, and if you can tell us a little bit about how the process of paper acceptance actually looks like, and how long actually take the paper to be published in your journals.
Sure. Foresight historically has predominantly been invited papers, meaning the editors reach out to people we know, we see speak, we see post something on LinkedIn. A couple of recent examples of that are, Johan, who I had reached out to based on something I saw on LinkedIn, and also Malte, who posted something. We are also doing a little bit of solicitation now for this special feature. I put a solicitation on LinkedIn that got a lot of people writing back to me that they had thoughts that they wanted to produce. So I think that's an area we're going to be exploring more with. And it also brings in new people that I didn't know previously, that expands our whole, our whole DNA pool to get more new good ideas out there. The process would be, either reach out to an editor, or, if you've got a manuscript already, send it in to me or one of the other editors, or start out with your idea. The time when it comes into us, I'll give it an initial review, may have some feedback for the authors that they can do immediately before I send it on to one of my column editors who are more focused, who have some additional skills in that specific area. Sometimes if it's a paper that's totally out of my realm that I feel I can't really give a proper assessment to, I'll pass it on first to one of my special editors to start the process. At that point, and we'll begin our back and forth with the authors, assuming we can come to some agreement on the content, the usefulness of the content. We'll work it through to publication. The process, typically, I'm looking for a manuscript, the initial draft, to come in 3 months prior to our publication date. So January 1st, I'm looking for manuscripts that will be published in the Q2 issue in early April. There may be an initial month of back and forth, a second month of further polishing, and then that third month, for example, the month of March, or right now going to the month of December, we basically have all our material edited. We're now handing it off to the design and layout person who's actually setting up the proofs of the journal and basically doing the production stage. So we fortunately can do things in about a 3-month turnaround time.
Yeah, for the IJF, it's a more classical, you could say, a process for scientific journals that we follow. There's lots of layers. We have an editor-in-chief, then we have the editors, then we have the associate editors, and then we have our reviewers, right? So there's many more layers of potential communications and delays and failures, unfortunately, on the way. But that's part of the scientific process. So typically, papers are submitted to me. They come directly to me through the editorial manager, which is the platform of Elsevier. And within 72 hours, within 3 days, I give it a first look, and I see whether it is appropriate to be considered as a submission to the journal. So not appropriate means that sometimes it's completely out of scope. Sometimes the work is not ready yet, so it's not written in proper English. There's not enough data to have a proper empirical study. There can be many reasons why the work is not ready. And so there we get back to the authors within 3 days. Maybe it's a bit more sometimes, but we try to stick to 3 days, and we inform them that the paper is not going to be considered. If it goes further, the paper is sent to an editor, and so then I'm not responsible for the paper anymore. It's the editors. We have 7 of these senior editors that handle the papers, and they ask an associate editor to handle the review process. So this associate editor will review the paper himself or herself, and also have at least 2 reviewers that will review the paper. Then this associate editor will formulate a recommendation to the editor based on the review and personal review. And with all this material, the editor will make a decision on the paper. Typically, this process is taking 4 months, I would say. The issue we may have with this kind of process is that if we have to do it several times, because after we send the first round of review comments and recommendation, a new version of the paper is produced, and then it has to go through the system again, right? So typically there are 2 or 3 rounds. So that makes, in principle, it takes 6 months to a year between the first submission of a paper and reaching a final version of a paper ready to be published, which is a normal turnaround for good journals today. Only these open access, quite aggressive journals are promising much faster turnaround time, but the classical journals, it would always be this kind of timeline that is considered.
Lovely. So actually, it's good to hear that that the journals are operating in the efficient manner, and actually we can expect the decision to be delivered in the expected.
I mean, it's as much as we can, you know. As I said, the process can vary a lot from reviewers can have personal circumstances, you know, that make some delays. Associate editors can be overloaded with some extra work, like during the COVID period, that made some delays. But in principle, for most papers, we managed to give feedback within 3 months, and then it takes maximum a year to the final publication.
I'd like to double click on Stefan's question about replicating IJF papers in short form. Is that like, you know, crossing over to Foresight, or is that more like Nature or Science where you have a brief one-pager vulgarizing a more in-depth paper later in the same issue?
So, I mean, for the IGF, I saw the question of Stefan. It is a bit of a pity that when Rob pushed this idea, it did not pick up much. I think the issue is often that the data are not made available, or the code, the original code from the paper, but we want to encourage that. I'm totally aligned with Rob's idea then, and many other journals are pushing for that. We have a reproducibility crisis in science in general, and especially with data science, you know, it's quite easy to get a data set to say something or something else, you know, depending on how you apply your models to it. So it is very important, and we have this format of short communication that can be used for that. If some people contact me saying, you know, we're trying to reproduce the work from this paper, and we can or we cannot, by the way, and we would like it to be published in the IGF, I'm really, really happy to consider these papers. It makes total sense. After, I don't know if it would make sense that this paper go to Foresight. In terms of consistency, it appears more normal that it would be together somehow in the IGF, right? It's in the same thread. But if people wanted to have that in Foresight as a more practitioner's view, you know, these academics, they promised us some results, but we tried it for real and it doesn't work. I wouldn't be upset that it's in Foresight. I think it could also make sense.
Yeah, and in principle, definitely welcome any of this replication and criticism. We tend to publish commentaries with our articles, where either one of the reviewers, someone on our editorial staff, or someone else can provide feedback, either some criticism of the approach or maybe some additional perspective on the approach. So that's probably the closest we come now to this sort of thing. But as Pierre said, this is an excellent practice, and it's unfortunate there's not more of it going on, you know, throughout literature everywhere.
So to add on that, just a quick comment, because it's always a discussion in the air. We've been discussing many years ago that we would force everybody to share their data when they publish in the IGF. And it's still, by the way, on the guidelines, but people can come with many excuses for not sharing the data. It can be coming from a company, so it's confidential, or you know, they can be different things. But still, we see in the data science, machine learning communities a strong push towards systematic sharing of everything, right? All the code, all the data have to be posted somewhere. So for us, it's a continuous discussion that we have with the editors. Is this something that we're going to make mandatory? Do we encourage it? Do we welcome it? You know, what's the tone? But obviously, it is something that we know is the right direction to go, because otherwise, you know, the progress is going to be very slow, and we cannot even trust the results that we read in the papers.
Once we've tackled the topic of reproducibility. Yep, exactly. Apologies for that. I would like to bring the Chauvin's question from the chat. So from the answer, we know that that aspect of the research is actually quite important, and we really need to make sure that we can reproduce the results of the papers that we submit. However, is there any format that is expected from the paper to bring the data and the code, or as Chauvin mentioned, maybe a GitHub link would be enough?
One of the reasons why I have not imposed, and I think Mike also with Foresight, there's no there's no strict guidelines about that. There's an issue with let's say local culture in different communities, different groups, different countries also on how people prefer to share. So for instance, in Europe, people have loved to use Zenodo as an archive for data sets, right? But I think, let's say people in China, they don't really care about using Zenodo. After people coming from computer science have been used for a long time to share GitHub links, and people in econometrics, not so much, right? So we have this kind of flexibility. So obviously we would like people to share, but we don't impose a certain way. I think today the classical approach would be GitHub for the code and Zenodo for the data. But we are not even asking for it. We let people decide how they prefer to share.
Yeah, we would welcome it to include that information in the references where they can get access to that. But at this point, we have not required it, and we don't get much of it.
Thank you for the answer. Let's call it the summary of the first part of the webinar. I will close it with a question. As a young researcher, a young forecaster, how do I decide that my paper is ready to be published at your journals, and whether also as a summary, how do I know where to publish, whether it's a forecast or Foresight or IJF?
Well, I have never been a young researcher, so so you may not want to trust anything I say here. But for Foresight, I think if you can articulate 3 to 5 key takeaways from your research work that are useful to someone actually doing forecasting, that tells you right there, that's a potential paper, something that you can convert into a Foresight paper. One thing I will encourage everyone to do is get as much use out of your writing, your research, anything you do as possible, meaning if you can generate an academic paper that you can publish in IJF or elsewhere, that can be highly technical and mathematical and methodological and everything else, extracting then the takeaways, publish that in Foresight. Maybe you can take the material and put a blog or a LinkedIn post out of it. Maybe you can run a webinar and present your findings or speak at a conference. You know, that you have limited time in your life and limited amount of research projects you can take on, but try to get as wide of audience as you can and extract the valuable pieces to these different audiences and present them in different ways. So that's one thing I learned when I was working for all these years at SAS, was anytime I created any new content, think about all the different ways where we could use that.
Yeah, and I'd like to add to that. Often as early career or junior researcher, we have this feeling we are alone, right? We have to prove ourselves. We are writing papers. We have to push them through the system, and we cross fingers that it's going to go through. And often we get very upset that it doesn't. But we should remember, you know, we are a community. And it's the role of the senior people, being the advisors or being some people who take editorial responsibility. You know, it's seen as service. That's the term that's used. It's a service to the community. So it is also something that is natural to do as a young researcher or young practitioner, to reach out to more senior people and ask for advice. You know, does that look like it's enough? Well, where do you think I should publish this kind of work? Could you help me in improving this work, right? And I think all my associate editors and editors would agree with me. We are very happy to do that. You know, if people reach out to us and ask us the question, you know, is this good enough? How can we make it good enough? Or would you advise me to submit it somewhere else? I think we are all very happy to help with that.
Perfect. So Mike, Pierre, thank you very much for your answer. I believe that will close the first part of the of our webinar. I think that I've managed to sneak in the questions from the chat, so I would open the floor to our lovely audience if there's any other questions that you would like to ask our guests today. I don't see any questions, so I will take a liberty to ask one question myself. If Mike, Pierre, if you have any maybe best practices or some tips, how one can make my article shine out of the others and to bring in the attention of the reviewer, and I believe that especially the second reviewer, which is legendary, let's say. If you can share it with us, that would be wonderful.
Making it easy as possible for the reviewers by keeping your paper concise, focused on those key points that you're trying to make them explicitly. Don't make us have to work to figure out what you're trying to say. I mean, clarity of writing, simplicity of writing, I prefer shorter, choppier sentences than long run-on sentences that are a paragraph long that, I got my brain spinning trying to figure out what's going on here. We have limited mental capabilities ourselves, or maybe it's just me and not so much the rest of my editors, but help us understand what you're trying to say, make it as clear as possible and as concise as possible.
I totally agree with Mike, but I'll say it in another way. The way I explain it to my junior collaborators and students is that editors, reviewers, all of us, we're actually quite shallow people, like everybody else. We focus first on the wrong things, on what's at the surface, and that's the quality of the writing, that's the care that's been taken in formatting the work, that's how good the figures are, and as Mike says, how easy it is to actually understand what you're trying to convey. The thing is, we totally agree. That's not what it should be about, right? The reviewers, the editors should focus on what's behind, right? The real work. The problem is that much as these people who are, experienced and supposed to be extremely objective, as much as they try to do that, they are always affected by the first impression with papers, right? So I think people should always put the right focus in making sure to write things correctly. As Mike was saying, try to make sure that you place yourself in the role of the reader. Is this going to be something easy to understand? Am I saying the right things in the right way? And really put all the efforts in doing the job right. Another thing, which is also very shallow, and you could say it's a bit unfair, but it shows a lot. The editors and reviewers will pay a lot of attention to the list of references and how the references are used. Because again, we're a community, right? So it's about knowing the work that has been done and that's relevant to the community. If someone starts to make some amazing claims about some type of work, but none of the foundation for doing this work is in the reference list, it starts to be a bit suspicious, right? So whenever you build your work, you have to think about all these angles. You have to show that you have strong foundations. You have to show that you've put the right effort to make your work accessible to others, right? And then typically editors and reviewers give you a lot more credit because they see you've put a lot of effort in trying to pitch your work and share it with others.
I'd like to just add something and disagree with Pierre here on one point on the shallowness of insisting on of insisting on all kinds of things like proper grammar, spelling, and stuff like that. I used to think that I was being shallow when I nitpicked submissions on exactly those points, but then honestly I've come to think that as a reviewer I'm trying to make this paper understandable and accessible to readers, and it's part of and getting the grammar right is just part of making the paper understandable to readers. So I think these things are really not all that shallow. They're really one important part of the reviewing. And
Cool.
that's why the author should make every effort to make sure their paper is easily
Yeah.
understood and grammatically correct. That's
Sure.
just my 5
So
cents.
no, but so we converge towards the same conclusion. Is that the use of the word shallow? You don't agree? No, what I was saying is like people are not shallow, or they don't want to be shallow anyway. It's just I say you're affected by this, and it's exactly what you express now, right? So I use this term because I think it provokes quite a few thoughts in my junior collaborators and students. But it's exactly what you say. Yeah, I totally agree.
Also, we recognize, well, it's easy for me here as a native English speaker in the United States, where we're publishing the journal, that not all, in fact, a big percentage of our authors are not native English speakers. Yeah. And so we recognize that as the material comes in, it may not have all the niceties, of a Shakespeare or Hemingway or something like that when it gets here. So we are, as long as it's, I guess, understandable enough that we can get the point that they're trying to make, and we think there's something useful there, we will work with the authors to get it into that very fine grammatical shape that Stefan talks about. We want you to make it as good as you possibly can, but we understand it may not be perfect in that first draft. And don't let that discourage you from submitting a paper to us just because you may feel your English is not perfect.
So I agree with Mike says, even though also as Stefan indicated, I'll say the appraisal of a paper is affected by presentation, by the quality of the text, etc. It's also the role of the editors to actually recognize, okay, there is something very interesting here, but I can see that the authors, they come from, I don't know where they are not native English speakers, that's obvious, and they have some issue in expressing their work, their ideas, etc. So then we can put extra effort, but we really have to be convinced there's something in there, right? At first, otherwise we cannot just make such an effort for all the papers that are coming in if we don't see that the scientific novelty is going to be good enough anyway.
Right, thank you very much for the discussion. I have the last question from the chat, and it is to you, Pierre, because it's explicit for IJF. Is it still considered okay to use the M4 dataset to validate methodological contribution, or should we use the M5 as well?
So yeah, so you record that. I have to be careful what you're going to tell us, Pierre and others. No, you have to see that the M competitions came firstly in a period where we were not sharing data. They were not open data sets for people to use as benchmark, right? So there's been a tradition in the forecasting community that we would focus on these few specific benchmarks that's been widely used, etc. I'm still happy if people want to use this M competition data, but I'm just saying we have to be more open-minded. There's so many reference data sets today around that are used as benchmark where people compete on them, on Kaggle or some other kind of competition and platform. So we should not be also obsessed that, only the M data set should be used if you want to benchmark your ideas. So you can use any data set that you find relevant. What is important is that it has to be argued. This is a reference data set. So we know this data set is a very good data set to benchmark ideas. And you also have to show that this data set has a broad interest. Because if you say it's a reference data set, but I'm the only one to use it to benchmark against myself, we also don't think it's going to bring the level of scientific debate or momentum that is important. But as long as you can bring a data set that meets this criteria I mentioned before, I'm very happy, even if they are not M competition data sets. I think it's actually good to broadly play with different kind of data sets around.
Can I add a comment, somewhat contrarian comment to that? I actually think there should be a rule, like there should be M4, 3 months, 4 months after it's published, nobody should use it for research anymore. Same thing with M4. There's this phenomena of meta overfitting.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
M5 comes up some interesting results. 2 or 3 months later, somebody beats the leader with a more interesting approach. And then after about 6 months or so, everybody and their cousin and their pet dog are beating the leader in M5, and there's some social level overfitting occurring there.
I totally agree with you. No, so it's a very nice and interesting comment. I think many people would agree with you that unfortunately it gets a bit dangerous that there's such focus on data set and time passes, and as you said, there might be this social overfitting that happens. The problem is that it's very difficult to control that. And it's also a bit strange to forbid people from using data sets. While for so many years we say we have to have open data for us to benchmark against each other and compete, right? So the problem is that we have to find the middle ground, the right strategy. And that's where what we discussed before with reproducibility comes in. You know, if people would systematically share their code, we could actually, when trying to reproduce, see if it's been some kind of overfitting, you know, some meta parameters have been optimized over the test set or these kind of things, right? Or if it's genuine. So I totally agree with your point. What I'm just saying is that we should also be careful, because if we start banning all the data set out there, at the end, only people coming with new data sets would be allowed to publish work, right, in the journal. And that's going to be a bit too restrictive, right?
Yeah, makes sense.
But that's a very good point. Maybe there should be an op-ed in Foresight about that, actually. Hey. It is a very good point. I mean, it's something we had an argument. It's not public argument, so I don't want to give names, but we've had an argument some years ago with some people about this, because they said it's unfair because you experienced forecasters, you know about this problem, right? But maybe a lot of junior people don't realize that this is wrong, right? Or this leads to some false claim. And maybe it's not public enough that all of us senior forecasters, we agree, you know, we know this problem. And we are very careful when we see this kind of works that come in claiming, you know, I can do much better on this data set that's been used and reused, right? But maybe you're right, it should be made more public that this is an issue for a community as well.
Yeah. I mean, I'm wondering if, like, I mean, it's kind of a stretch to get this organized, but something like the Fred data set, where it's the same data set, but it's also being updated consistently and frequently. So, okay, it's the same data set, but it's also moving forward almost the way a production time series would, you know, find a set of time series like that and benchmark against them versus against a static or M5.
So this is one way. I know that in the US, for instance, for renewable energy forecasting, what they have done is that they make it a continuous stream. So every hour when there's new data, the data set is updated. And so whenever people want to run a benchmark, it will always be with a new flavor of the data set, right? Because it's been updated continuously. This is great, but that means someone needs to have responsibility for doing this, right? Or someone or some entity will be making sure that these data sets are updated. So it's quite costly and requires some organization.
Thank you. I'm minding the time. There's still one question. So Mike, Pierre, if I can ask you for a short answer to that question. If it happens that I have the theoretical model, which I personally believe it is worth publishing in IJF, but I also find good applications that can be published in Foresight. First of all, is it well, whether it is accepted that I firstly publish in IJF and then in Foresight basically on the same model? And also the second part, if I have the application for the Foresight, should I wait firstly for my theoretical model to be published in the IJF, and once it has been accepted, then I should send my application to Foresight, or I can do it simultaneously?
I'll also ask Stefan to weigh in on this one as the deputy editor here. Certainly, it's nice if it's gone through the vetting of an IJF editors and published there. That's great. That gives us an extra level of confidence in the material. But I don't feel it's it's absolutely necessary to wait for that. I mean, our editors will also vet it, and do our best to provide a critical evaluation of if there's something worthwhile there. Stefan?
Yeah, if you ask me, then I'll answer. Sometimes even practitioners have been known to be able to provide some improvements to a paper that might even improve the theoretical version of the paper. So maybe even that could happen. So I would say always just submit early, submit often.
Yeah, I was going to say, I also totally agree. I mean, there's no linkage between the two journals in that sense. There would be some conditionality or adaptation to timelines, etc. If you feel the idea has value on both sides, more on the scientific debate and the practitioner side, there's no reason why you would not contact both journals and have your work considered. And you could even tell the editors if you wanted, so that it's discussed in between. I don't know if it's relevant, right? But no, definitely it should not, you should not restrain yourself in terms of timing or reaching out.
Lovely, thank you.
The editorial staffs of both journals to a large extent know each other and can communicate if necessary.
Perfect. Unfortunately, I believe that our time comes to the end. So, dear audience, thank you very much for joining. I believe that it was a super interesting webinar. Mike, Pierre, thank you very much for joining the webinar. It was a pleasure to have you here. If there's any other questions from you audience that you would like to ask, then I encourage you to write it the email to us, which is the forecasters@forecasters.org, and hopefully see you all at the next webinar.
Yeah. See you. Thanks for today. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much for joining.
Bye-bye.